It was sudden. There's lots behind what happened, which, as I said, will come out.
For confrontation and controversy.
They're picking on a certain level and a type of class of people.
A Manchester judge likened the show to bear baiting.
I would question the amount of help and support.
One guest had been found dead a week after appearing on the show.
The death of Steve Diamond, who died shortly after failing a lie detector test on the show.
Permanently cancelled earlier today following the death of a participant.
I think initially, I think I suffered from real shock.
His name is Jeremy. Jeremy, Kyle.
When you needed to find out if your boyfriend was cheating on you with your cousin's best friend, who was there for you? Jeremy. When you'd been refusing to pay child support for a child that you didn't think was yours, who was there for you? Jeremy. When millennial kids up and down the country were ill and had to have a day off school, who was there for them at 9:25 AM on ITV? Jeremy frickin' Kyle, that's who. Every time. What a treat. If you don't know what the Jeremy Kyle Show is because you're too young or something, first of all, how dare you? Second of all, allow me to explain. The daytime talk show ran for 14 years from 2005 to 2019, presented by a man named Jeremy Kyle, who would have members of the British public on the talk show talking about their problems in front of a live studio audience, which honestly gave way to some hilarious moments such as this.
Thought you were sending explicit pictures of your private parts to her.
I sent one and I had a bad day at work.
And this?
You girlfriend, that's Sophie.
Look at her.
She what?
Look at her.
Look at her.
Look at her.
And this?
I might catch something off her because she goes round sleeping with other people.
No, don't!
Me?
But entwined with these very authentic, funny moments were also some really dark and painful ones. The whole premise of the show was for Jeremy to facilitate people talking about deeply personal issues, often involving relationship and family dysfunction, addiction, theft, and most episodes included a story that required a DNA test to discover a child's biological parent or a lie detector test to help resolve some sort of family dispute. The programme branded itself as a conflict resolution show, acknowledging that yes, sometimes there was shouting and swearing and crying and heightened emotions and sometimes violence, but Jeremy and the crew were always striving for resolution for their guests. I mean, they did have an aftercare team, which was frequently mentioned on the show, led by a man named Graham Stanier, who had a master's degree in psychotherapy and counselling. I was about 9 or 10 years old when the Jeremy Kyle Show first started, so I'm of a generation that quite literally grew up with it. By the time I got to secondary school, it was very much in the popular zeitgeist, a household name. People would talk about it at school. Me and my friends would watch reruns at each other's houses, and we bloody loved it. The drama of it all. The way we saw it, I think, was a little bit like the way we saw embarrassing X Factor auditions. We'd get secondhand cringe from seeing grown adults on the Jeremy Kyle Show seemingly lack any self-awareness or self-respect. We saw Jeremy Kyle, the host, as a voice of reason, the rational authority over a bunch of unruly chavs. I remember the first time I ever heard somebody criticise the show. It was my, at the time, 70-year-old grandmother who just said to me, I don't know how you can watch that. It's people ruining their lives for entertainment. I was like, what are you talking about? Jeremy, he's helping people. Graham, the aftercare team. Conflict resolution. But it is true that the Jeremy Kyle Show was becoming more and more controversial as the years went on. Yeah, some people loved it, but some people hated it with a passion and believed it was exploiting vulnerable working class people for money and views. And who was Jeremy Kyle to be having a go at these people anyway? Who made him boss? Well, actually, that was Tom and Lucy McLennan, but we'll get on to that a bit later. Before we get more into the ethics of the Jeremy Kyle Show, I think we should talk about how it managed to exist in the first place.
Oi, look, there's a chap. That means council housed and violent.
I don't mean to alarm anyone, but I think Britain has got a teensy bit for class obsession. I guess it's always been this way, but in the 2000s, the television and media were rampant with the demonisation of the working class. This is how Britain likes to unwind in the evening, by sneering at other classes and sneering at people for sneering about class, which I guess is kind of what I'm doing right now. Thank you for the read, Ms. Freeman. We saw sketch shows and comedians on TV such as Little Britain, The Catherine Tate Show, Lee Nelson, depicting characters as chavs, as well as series like The Royal Family, Benidorm, Shameless. Critics said that Shameless used to be edgy and fun, whereas later seasons just make the people of Manchester and Salford look like low-life idiots. And this is the thing, working class people want to see working class characters on screen, but it can often lean more towards stereotyping and demonising than actually representing. Britain off screen was just as obsessed. The government had these things called ASBOs, which could be given to anyone, but culturally they became synonymous with unruly teenage chavs. And by 2005, ASBOs were being handed out like sweets on Halloween, my friends, seeing an 18% rise in their usage from the year before. A human rights commissioner actually accused the UK of having ASBO mania, which definitely sounds like a girl group from the 90s. And the government's suspicion around hoodies and the constant discussion around the youth and knife crime and gang culture. I remember being a teenager at this time so clearly, and it really felt like every adult thought there was a gang on every street corner and we were just stabbing our classmates every day. 2014 saw a TV show called Benefit Street come out, a supposed documentary series filming several residents of a particular street in Birmingham where a lot of the people were unemployed, and Jeremy Corbyn, a previous leader of the Labour Party, called this poverty porn. With the social landscape of Britain in the noughties and 2010s looking a bit like this, it's not hard to see how the Jeremy Kyle Show fit into this all quite nicely. The Jeremy Kyle Show was born out of a combination of the UK's obsession with class and demonisation of the lower classes, as well as reality TV trends trickling in from the US in the 2000s. In this era, tabloid American TV shows involving the general public were very popular, like The Jerry Springer Show, The Steve Wilkos Show, Maury. Basically what I'm saying is, who gave old white men the right? And how do we get it back? The Jerry Springer Show is probably the most well-known one. By the way, did you know that Jerry Springer is a sextuple threat? A broadcaster, journalist, actor, producer, former lawyer and politician. Yeah, politician. Jerry was the mayor of Cincinnati in the 70s. Please. Who is allowing these men to just do whatever they like? Somebody stop them! The Jerry Springer Show ran from 1991 to 2018 for some reason, and it originally started as a continuation of Jerry's political commentary, so nothing like what we know it as today. Jerry's show is actually modelled on the Paul Donahue Show, which started in 1970 and was more like a traditional talk show with hard-hitting journalism such as, "Are the gays born this way?" So as Jerry Springer and other tabloid talk shows were becoming more popular, across the pond in the UK, plans were being hatched. Executive producers at ITV imported the American style of tabloid talk show. There was already a current affairs talk show on ITV hosted by Trisha Goddard, but in 2001 ITV said, "Trisha darling, you know what would make this better if you were more like Jerry Springer? Be more Jerry, Trisha, it's not that hard." And that's when they started incorporating lie detector and DNA tests on the show and involving more working class guests. Then around 2005, the Trisha Goddard show moved to a different channel, and in its place came the Jeremy Kyle Show.
Jeremy Kyle got the nation laughing at other people's expense. Somebody tell that guy that we hate him too, we are not his friends. Yeah.
Okay, so we understand how the Jeremy Kyle Show came about. We vaguely know about some of its criticisms. Time for the nitty-gritty. What are the actual problems with the Jeremy Kyle Show? There was a study done called the Great British Class Survey, where sociologists assessed whether Britain still has the three traditional classes that we think of, so working class, middle class and upper class. The survey concluded that Britain now has expanded to have 7 classes. So these are mostly newer terms, including the precariat, which has come about to describe this underclass of people, if you want to call it an underclass. There have been criticisms of the Great British Class Survey as well as the term precariat, so I'll leave you guys to make up your own mind on those things. But according to the survey, the precariat is the most disadvantaged group, who are facing unstable jobs with 0-hour contracts or temp work, meaning they don't often reap benefits such as paid holiday or a meaningful pension. They struggle to have an occupational narrative to their lives. If you've seen the Jeremy Kyle Show, you'll know it's very much about personal responsibility and not really about the larger structures that we we live with him. But it is these people from these backgrounds that are appearing or appeared on the Jeremy Kyle show. And a lot of people feel that the show exploits these vulnerable, financially disadvantaged people and their personal issues for the sake of entertainment. Now, I don't know how many Jeremy Kyle guests would have fallen into the legal definition of a vulnerable adult, but generally when people are making this criticism of the show, they're using the word vulnerable as a catch-all term to describe how some of the guests may have not fully understood what they were getting themselves into but consented anyway, or how they may have been susceptible to manipulation from the producers. Trauma, mental illness, addiction, learning disabilities, a lack of support network, a limited education, are all factors that might make someone vulnerable to being exploited. It doesn't automatically mean that someone with one or more of those things is being exploited, but I think it's fair to say that it's a factor. The rate of mental health issues within the demographic that is represented on the Jeremy Kyle show is quite high. Children from the lowest income families are 4.5 times more likely to experience severe mental health issues compared to children from wealthier families. Drug addiction can occur anywhere, but deprived areas of Britain are associated with a younger age of first trying drugs, as well as decreased chances of recovering from drug addiction. But poor people have been vilified and treated with such disgust that a middle-class person with an addiction and relationship problems will be viewed very differently to a precariat person with an addiction and relationship problems. And this is one of the things that people think the Jeremy Kyle show was exploiting. They didn't have wealthy, university educated guests on the show. They were very intentionally seeking out a certain demographic. 3 years after the show was cancelled, Channel 4 brought out a documentary and spoke to some anonymous whistleblowers who used to be producers on the Jeremy Kyle show, who explained that during the process of getting participants, it was the producers' jobs to go through a mental health checklist with potential guests to see if they were mentally sound enough to be on the show. These producers now admit that none of them were equipped or qualified to do this, and how sometimes they would actually skip over relevant information because they were under so much pressure from their management to book people onto the show. That might be one of the wildest aspects to the Jeremy Kyle story, that producers with no mental health qualifications were trying to determine whether people were well enough to be on TV. Like, this just went on for 14 years and everyone was like, yes, no, this is good actually. Let's keep doing this. Here's what I find difficult about all of this. How do we have this conversation without infantilizing a whole social class of people, making them seem stupid or unable to make their own choices? Who's to say that a person on universal credit living in social housing isn't capable enough to make an informed decision about appearing on national TV? In an effort to protect people, I sometimes do think we can be condescending and strip people of their agency. In 2019, once the show was cancelled, there was an inquiry held looking into the show where the executive producer and ITV director both claimed that informed consent was a priority. The guests always knew what they were getting themselves into, and a lot of them would be desperate to come on the show and talk to Jeremy. Personally, I don't doubt that that was the case for some of the guests, that they had an understanding of what they were doing. At the same time, I think there were a lot of guests who were vulnerable, and maybe they consented, but it wasn't informed consent. And I think the show lacked ethics and failed on their duty of care by allowing some guests onto the show. I don't think they put up enough barriers to protect vulnerable members of the public. So, we've talked about how I think the Jeremy Kyle show exploited individual people from disadvantaged backgrounds for the sake of entertainment. I also think that the show was exploiting the problems of these people to carry a political agenda. And I don't think that this was consciously on the mind of everyone who worked for the Jeremy Kyle show. I know that there were some producers who came from working class families, so I don't think they were sat around plotting like, how do we make poor people look bad? Nevertheless, when we think about Britain's culture of demonising the poor, the Jeremy Kyle show definitely spoke to this culture, reinforcing stereotypes, not really leaving much room for compassion, pushing the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and the British stiff upper lip. A UK anti-poverty charity says that shows present people with less money as having failed, which can make a tax-paying audience less approving of government support that these people might get. Drug and alcohol charity Addiction say that the way substance use is portrayed on shows like Jeremy Kyle is really unhelpful. When people are demonised or blamed, it makes it harder for them to get help. They don't come forward. Services designed to protect them are cut. Policymakers don't prioritise them. When we put someone on TV and look for ways to say you don't matter, we are absolutely failing that person. And in each episode, Jeremy stresses the importance of personal responsibility. And I'm not saying that that's not important, but I am saying that there's evidence to suggest recurrent poverty and the cycle of no pay, low pay is real, and then that makes these families vulnerable to other things. And it might take more than shouting at someone on national TV to help people break out of that. The Jeremy Kyle Show paints a picture. When middle-class people with good jobs and university-educated parents and grandparents watch something like Jeremy Kyle in the wider context of media in the 2000s, it makes sense that they are going to think they know what being working class is and retain those stereotypes. For example, they might think that drinking excessively is a poor person's problem, even though middle classes actually drink more alcohol than working classes. It also sends a message with how Jeremy talks to the guests. Like, he's not nice to them. The show ran for 14 years, so I'm sure there were occasions where Jeremy was soft and compassionate with the guests, and I'm not even really accusing him of being compassionless. But if the British public see a man like Jeremy on daytime TV getting up in people's faces, calling them low-life scum, it sends a message that that is a fine attitude to have. It creates this sense that Jeremy and the audience are superior to the guests that are on the stage. We're in this unique position as an audience where we're able to judge these people and their decisions when we actually know pretty little about them and they know nothing about us. So we're in the safe zone. Our dirty laundry isn't being aired, so it's pretty safe to judge other people when we know our turn is never coming. Earlier I mentioned consent and informed consent, and this was quite a big talking point during the show's inquiry. So, like, we all know that people who go on talk shows or reality TV are consenting to it, right? They're saying yes to being filmed. Oftentimes they're the ones applying for it. So there's really no argument about whether the Jeremy Kyle guests consented to being on the show or not. Of course they did. They signed the contracts. They knew they were going on national television. The issue we run into here is the difference between consent and informed consent. The team on the Jeremy Kyle Show does insist that the guests gave their informed consent, but I don't know about that one, Chief. I think that there's two options here. The show is either bold-faced lying to avoid admitting any legal fault, or they genuinely don't understand what informed consent is. The distinction between the two first came about in the medical field, I believe.
Valid informed consent has 3 requirements. First, it must be voluntary. Second, it must be informed. And third, the individual must be capable of giving their consent. It cannot be forced, it cannot be coerced, and it cannot be manipulated. A patient must have enough information to make a good decision. As one would expect, every patient has a different level of knowledge coming into an appointment, and many treatments or interventions have different factors that ought to be stated or emphasized. In each individual case, more or less information may be required, and different details may need to be pointed out. A helpful introductory guide of information that a reasonable person would need consists of the nature of the treatment or intervention, the expected benefits, the risks and side effects, the likely consequences of not having the treatment or intervention, and any alternative courses of action. Details such as these, as well as answering any questions the patient may have, need to be brought up because they are important for the patient to make their decision. The patient must understand the information they have been given. Informed consent is not valid if the patient has been told all of the relevant information but didn't understand a word they were told. The patient must also be able to appreciate the reasonable, foreseeable consequences of their decision or lack of decision. They need to be able to use the information they were given to balance the risks and benefits of their choice.
So obviously the Jeremy Kyle Show isn't a medical thing, but I think these points are important to consider. So consent can't be forced, manipulated or coerced. However, in the Channel 4 documentary, the producers were telling a different story about what was happening backstage. And I just want to say that all the producers that were interviewed for this documentary were all anonymous and their words were spoken by actors. And you could definitely argue that this is all hearsay. They're just disgruntled ex-employees who are making it all up. but I don't believe that. But some people will, and as some of their claims don't have concrete proof, I just wanted to make that clear. But in the documentary, the producers mentioned several times about how they would lie or use reverse psychology on potential guests to get them to do what they wanted. And people will say that the guests were coming to the show asking to be on, which is true. But maybe they were on the fence about it, or maybe they changed their minds partway through the process. The producers said that they would keep badgering the guests and play them like you were doing them a favour. There was an example given of a family of a drug addict that couldn't afford the cost of private rehab and felt Jeremy Kyle was their only option. So the producers lied to them and told them that they had one spot in rehab and that there were other families competing for this one spot as well, and that Jeremy would be deciding who to give it to create this sense of longing in this family, and then once they'd finally be invited, they'd feel this sense of being really lucky. Informed consent.
They applied to the show because they knew what the show involved. They wanted to be on it, they'd seen it every day, they were fans of it, I assume, or thought that it could bring them benefit. So they started with a very high level of knowledge of not only the show, the way the show was produced, the way it was presented, the effect on the people taking part.
Yeah, but did they? Part of being informed is that people must have enough information in order to consent. So this means that the risks and the consequences must be clearly laid out for the person. You could argue that the guests have seen the show, so they know that Jeremy might have a go at them, or that the audience might laugh at them. But the truth is that the guests might not know that. Some vulnerable people might not understand that unless the producers explicitly said it to them. You could say use your common sense, but I don't know how to tell you this. Some people don't have common sense. And think about whether the guests were informed about what might happen after the show is aired. When you watch the Jeremy Kyle show, you have no way of knowing what is happening in the lives of the guests once they've gone back home. We have no idea if they're facing online harassment, if they're having more family problems, or they're in trouble at work or struggling to find work as a result of being on the show. How were prospective Jeremy Kyle guests meant to assess the real life implications of being on the show if they had no idea what they were? And remember, the show started in 2005. I think nowadays, with the prominent use of social media and with the rise of shows like Love Island, we are a little bit more clued up about what happens to reality TV participants after their show has aired. But with that being said, I think average people like you and me who are not public figures think we'd know what the backlash would be like, but experiencing it firsthand would probably be way more overwhelming than we'd expect it to be.
Do you have dyslexia or difficulty reading and writing? That's read out to the individuals, is it?
It's read out, yes.
And the answers that come from that, if somebody says, no, I'm fine, or yes, I'm fine, is any further pursuant of that?
So, ID paper. So that was mainly, that the main flag for that would be, because when we go through the consent forms and everything else, then we'd be made aware of that, so we could go through more fully with it.
So what I'm concerned about here is what assessment is your, whether it's researchers or anybody else, giving to the people who have applied to be on the show about their understanding, their level of language skills, their understanding of their literacy skills, their understanding of the comprehension of what, having read some of these documents, are quite complex legalese documents. How?
But it's something that, obviously, did concern me, and it's something that we, I feel we took very seriously. But I can see where your concern is.
But how? You're not answering my question, not telling me in any way, shape or form where you're assessing these skills.
You know how I mentioned that the producers were the ones doing the mental health checks? These were the same checks where they'd be looking for any disabilities, which, as you can imagine, might affect the ability of the guests to read or understand their contracts. And part of informed consent is the person giving it must have the capacity to consent. And because the producers weren't qualified to be doing these checks, how would they know?
What you're saying to them, Mr. Stanier, basically, you're really distressed, we just walk off, it's okay. Then they're put with a member of your production team, and then effectively they become part of their entertainment once again. They're still in camera, so what you're effectively doing is a moment of distress that you have said to them, a way out, you, Mr. McClellan, are then effectively creating an environment for them to further exploit that stress at the sides. That's correct, isn't it?
I don't agree with the word exploit.
So informed consent is about not being manipulated. It's about having enough information and having the risks communicated, actually being capable to consent and being able to withdraw consent at any time, which the guests couldn't really do. I guess they were able to back out before production began, but once it started, they obviously had no editorial control. There have even been some guests that have asked to have their episode removed and it hasn't been. Producers and the therapist, Graham, would tell guests that if they felt overwhelmed or really distraught at any point, they could leave the Jeremy Kyle stage. But what is one of the things that the show is well known for doing? Following the distressed guests backstage with Jeremy and a camera crew in their face. Informed consent brings me on to what may be the most contentious aspect of the Jeremy Kyle show, and arguably the thing that got it cancelled, which is the lie detector tests. People could come onto the show with pretty much any problem under the sun and request that their loved one do a lie detector test, or ask to do one themselves to prove their innocence about something. And Jeremy, the presenter of the show, would offer the results with conviction.
So we asked your son, did you steal the money that went missing from Dawn's house? Your son said no. Why did you say no?
I'm telling the truth.
Your son's a liar, love.
It really gives the impression to the audience that these results are definitive and true. The company that the show used was UK Lie Detectors, and tests were usually done the day before or the day of filming. But during the inquiry after the show's cancellation, we not only find out that the lie detectors are not 100% accurate, but there isn't a specific industry success rate. Different lie detector companies will claim different percentages, and the documentary reveals that the producers were all claiming different success rates to different guests that they would be speaking to. For some of the producers, the inquiry was the first time that they heard about these discrepancies. I just got a question. Did no one ever think of sending like a mass email? Just CCing everyone in and being like, hey guys, 95% is the figure that we're going for. It's not necessarily accurate, but that's the one we're all going to be saying. Okay, so maybe you're thinking lie detectors don't have a 100% success rate, but if people are consenting to taking them, what's the problem with that? The problem is if a producer is telling a guest that this lie detector test is 98% accurate, for example, but omits the details about there being no general scientific consensus and different companies claiming different success rates, that isn't informed consent. And it's not just the guests that might have been manipulated here, it's the audience as well. And again, I think people can argue that this should be common sense, but some people watching Jeremy Kyle won't realise that this isn't an exact science. The results were always presented as if they were true. And even during the times where the guests came up as deceitful, but were adamant they were telling the truth, even when they were settled in back home, the show would refuse to give a second lie detector test. A few years ago, there was an incident with a man named Adrian, who went on the Jeremy Kyle show to do a lie detector test and prove his innocence after being accused of theft. He swears that he's telling the truth, but his results came back as deceptive, and this basically ruined this poor man's life. He told the producers he was suicidal, but they aired the show anyway, and everyone in his community thought he was a thief. So Adrian attempted to hang himself, and the only reason he survived is because his partner found him. Adrian then spent 2 years in his bedroom with severe mental health difficulties, and we only know his story because his partner talks about it on the Channel 4 documentary, as Adrian's psychologist says he's still too unwell to talk about this publicly. So Adrian's story brings me on to safeguarding and support in general. I mean, was there any? As I mentioned before, the Jeremy Kyle show had an aftercare team that we would see on screen from time to time, led by a man named Graham Stanier, who worked as a nurse for several years, then went into occupational health, then took some time out to study his master's degree in psychotherapy and counselling. So Graham isn't a psychologist, and he worked in a team of 4 people on the show who also aren't psychologists, but are mental health nurses.
Who on the production was the person that was that fully qualified psychologist who was qualified with the and registered with the Healthcare Professionals Council?
Sorry, Graham was the head of our aftercare.
Who acted as your professional second opinion, and what qualifications did your second opinion have?
Second opinion.
So, did you work in isolation?
We have four members of the team, and we work as a team, and we have supervision with each other within that team.
You don't have a professional secondary opinion of someone who is a qualified psychologist who is registered with the health and...
In terms of a second person to say someone is suitable?
Well, yes. I mean...
No, that system doesn't exist.
Okay. Can I add in Mr McLennan and Mr Bellamy? Why is there nobody a member of the Health and Care Professionals Council embedded with this team?
I think this is something we're going to have to come back to on.
The short answer is that we felt confident that the duty of care processes were robust.
Yeah. You're still confident?
Yes, I am still confident in the processes.
Julian, you sound like a knobhead. Graham also had no supervision and no one to give a professional second opinion. He says that him and his team supervised each other, but since Graham was the head of the team, I don't really know how people underneath you can then supervise you. As part of the Jeremy Kyle show trying to resist any responsibility for anything, their arguments always return to the guests wanting to be on the show and the guests looking up to Jeremy and wanting to hear his advice. But this begs the following questions. Who is Jeremy to be giving advice, and is it actually Jeremy who offers the advice anyway?
But I think they think Jeremy's, they have a positive impression of Jeremy, that's why they want to be on the show.
Yeah, of course.
But what the notes say to them that you provide is that he's going to offer help and guidance to them. Whereas in fact what he's doing, he's putting them on the telly. He's not there to help them, he's there to entertain.
People who watch the show on a daily basis knew what Jeremy was. Yeah, of course, some of the clips and some of the things that we...
What is Jeremy?
Yeah, what is Jeremy? Honestly, at this point, great question. Jeremy isn't a mental health professional. He isn't involved in the aftercare treatment. He is literally just a TV presenter who's expressing his opinions about the lives of the people on his show. The whole point of Jeremy talking to the guests is to create a spectacle for the audience. Then the guests get passed along to Graham and maybe rehab facilities, things like that. So Jeremy is literally just the middleman between the guests having a problem and trying to find help. If you've watched the show or have just lived in Britain in the past few years, you'll know that Jeremy has a reputation for being very confrontational and quite cold. Even the people who like him for those reasons. They think that he's no nonsense and tells it like it is. He is not known for being gentle or de-escalating conflict, and during sensitive moments like revealing the results of a DNA test or a lie detector, Jeremy still uses this very direct approach.
In your professional opinion, is this acceptable behaviour? Are you comfortable with what you saw?
It's not the behaviour I would employ. That is the presenter style, and I have...
I know it's his style, and I'm aware of his style, but are you, as a professional, comfortable with what you saw?
I'm responsible for me. I'm responsible for me and my behaviour. I can't be responsible for the presenter's behaviour.
Well, when, if ever, did you go to Mr McLennan and say, this programme should not be broadcast in my professional opinion? How many times?
No, but because why would I say that? I'm trying to understand why.
Well, okay.
Me? The show's mental health professional? Graham says that he doesn't support Jeremy's behaviour, but at the end of the day, he's only responsible for himself. He's also never advised for a second lie detector test because, again, he doesn't see why he would need to do that, despite some guests being really quite distraught with the results. Graham says all of this during the inquiry where the executive producer and director are insisting that any recommendations Graham made were always followed, as he was respected as the head of mental health on the show. I definitely think Graham and the mental health team let the guests down and could have done better. I also understand how they might have felt intimidated at times to step in, as there have been 2 ex-producers that described the Jeremy Kyle show as a cult and Jeremy as a cult leader. So I can understand how Graham might have felt intimidated if that was the sort of environment. But even beyond Graham, it just seems like there were no robust or reliable systems in place to be taking care of the guests. Like, it really comes across like the show just like wasn't that bothered. And like we've already talked about, the process of onboarding the guests doesn't really seem that smooth and organised either. It was down to the producers to check for any mental health issues and literacy comprehension, which they're not qualified to do. And also surrounding mental health, they're kind of relying on guests to self-disclose, which they just might not do. And this brings up guests getting permission from their GP to be on the show, which some of them did actually have to get, but I wonder if this should have been compulsory for every single guest on the show. I'm guessing the Jeremy Kyle Show's response to that would be that that's too time consuming, but maybe that's an indicator that your show isn't very practical or very safe. Something that really stands out about all of this to me is what happens to the guests afterwards. So they've gone through a mental health check with an unqualified TV producer. They're part of this spectacle on stage with Jeremy giving out advice, but not really giving out advice. They're possibly quite distressed at this point, and then they're handed over to the aftercare team with 1 therapist and 3 mental health nurses, who then signpost them to their GP or a mental health service. They signpost them. The guests are also told that there's counselling available post-production, but it's entirely up to them whether they take up that offer or not. So it's kind of confusing, honestly. Like, it seems like the mental health referrals are not referrals at all. They're just recommendations. It sounds like it's all very like hands off. Like, you can get the help if you want, but we're not really going to enforce it, which to me sounds like the Jeremy Kyle team are not taking their duty of care very seriously. There's also the really concerning issue of domestic violence and abuse, because obviously the show deals with a lot of relationship problems and possible mental health problems. Graham says that him and the producers do look out for possible signs of abuse, and they do things like speak to couples separately and source check, meaning they might speak to the couple's friends and families on the phone to see if they've ever noticed abuse in that relationship. But again, this is kind of messy and confusing, because when does this happen? Does this happen with every single couple that comes on the show, or is it just select couples? And what happens if it is revealed that abuse is present in that relationship? Well, Graham says that the couple won't go on to filming, and the victim will also be signposted to domestic abuse services. Signposted. I really can't believe how lazy all of this sounds. Something interesting I noticed is that Jeremy actually contradicts something that Graham said. Graham said that if abuse is present in a relationship, then that couple won't go on to filming. But in Jeremy's book, he claims that many of the guests on the show have reported domestic violence. Oh yeah, our Jezza wrote a book.
My lifestyle's terribly wild, but you never catch me on the Jeremy Kyle Show.
What is Jeremy? What is he?
Is she? Who is she? Who is she? Where did you find her?
What makes Jeremy an authority on modern Britain? What credentials does he have? Well, from his 2009 bestseller, I'm Only Being Honest, Adjeza said that he grew up with his mum and dad. I think they said in London. And I feel like he's trying really hard in this book to sound more working class than he actually is, to sound more relatable. Or at the very least, he's trying quite hard to downplay how privileged his family background is. His mum was a bank teller and his dad worked for the literal Queen. He also says that he was average at school, whatever that means. I don't think he mentions whether it was a private school that he went to, but later on an ITV employee did say that Jeremy went to a private school, but I can't be sure about that. Jeremy then later went on to get a second-class degree in history and sociology, but as a graduate ended up getting jobs in recruitment and insurance. He was then offered a small slot on a radio station. I do feel like there's a bit of the story missing here, but that's all I could find. And he worked for a bunch of different radio stations throughout the country in the 90s before moving on to some of the larger stations in the 2000s, such as Virgin Radio and Capital FM. Apparently, what he was known for on the radio was his late night phone-in shows called Late and Live and Jezza's Confessions, which I think were sort of the blueprints for what the Jeremy Kyle Show would later turn into. I think what happened next was Tom and Lucy McLennan, who are a couple of bigwigs at ITV, heard Jeremy on the radio and thought that he would be good on the television. If Jeremy's allowed to be honest, then so am I. And I was really expecting this book to be written better than it was. Like, it's not very well formatted. It kind of reads like a long rambly blog post with no particular structure, where Jeremy is just sharing his thoughts on modern Britain, but with no real insights. or exploration. It was very young people are ruining everything, and his thought process kind of stops there. I was honestly expecting more from him. I don't really know why. I was trying to give our Jezza a chance. And the book is full of hot topics that the media loved at this time, such as teenage pregnancy and antisocial behaviour. I went into, I'm only being honest, with the hope to learn something about Jeremy Kyle. Away from the sensationalism of the show, I wanted to learn something about him as a person and how he thinks. And I think the most interesting thing that I'm taking away from reading this book is that, in my opinion, it doesn't really seem like he is able to think about his thoughts. Here's what I mean. He criticises young people for rushing into relationships and having children early, and praises himself and older generations for taking marriage seriously. But at the time of writing this book, he'd already been divorced once, and since then has been divorced another time and is on to his third marriage. Listen, I'm not criticising his relationship history. I'm criticising the inconsistency in his views. He does this kind of thing a lot in the book where he'll kind of state an opinion, but it's almost like the opinion applies to everyone else but him. That's annoying enough, but what's more annoying to me is that I don't think he even realises that that is what he's doing. Like, Jeremy tells a story about a guest with a pathetic cannabis habit and how he wouldn't have time to maintain his addiction if he simply got a job. He says that addicts disgustingly prioritise their habit above everything else. But then, later on in the book, Jeremy says he didn't realise how powerful alcohol addiction was until he had a period of flirting with heavy alcohol consumption. So for the guy who came on his show, his substance abuse was disgusting and pathetic. But for Jeremy's own substance abuse, well, it surprised him at how powerful a grip it could really have. His flirtation with alcohol, whatever that means, came after the Jeremy Kyle show was majorly attacked in the press in 2007. And Jeremy says that after this, he descended into self-pity with alcohol. He hinted at marriage and home life troubles as well, said this was the darkest period of his life and that no one could possibly know how he was feeling. So you can see how Jeremy characterises his own struggle with substances compared to how he characterises other people's. It's like he's not able to think outside of his own experience. And that's not even the end of it, right? In 2008, there was another Jeremy Kyle scandal in the press where I believe he was photographed at a betting shop. Jeremy had previously disclosed that he had had a problem with gambling at other points in his life. In his book, he explains that he got an apprenticeship at a betting shop when he was 16, and that's when his interest first began in gambling. But by his early 20s, he'd racked up £12,000 worth of debt from gambling. Jeremy said that in his 20s he realised it was an issue and he worked really hard to become debt-free by the time he was 29. Which is, you know, great for our Jezza. What I really don't want to do here is talk down on Jeremy for his experience with gambling and alcohol, because that's exactly what I'm criticising him for doing to other people. Instead, what I want to highlight is how Jeremy seems to have explanations and grace for his own behaviour, which I think is valid, to be honest, but he doesn't seem to allow guests on his show to have explanations or grace for their behaviour, which is inconsistent. The strangest thing about this addiction stuff is that Jeremy admits in the book addiction experts won't agree that he still gambles. At the time of writing this book, he'd had no professional help, or not any that he was admitting to, yet continues to gamble and drink even though he's aware that addiction experts might advise against it. His self-concept seems to be that he's beating the odds, pardon the pun, and that he's strong enough to engage with these activities. It's weird because at the same time as confessing how much gambling in particular had a real impact on his life, he's also like minimizing his problems. Like I said, his thoughts seem kind of inconsistent to me and don't tie together cohesively. Jeremy goes on to say that he's not sure if he has obsessive compulsive disorder, but is often told by other people that he shows traits of it. He says that he's very wary of labels because his parents are very wary of labels. You can think for yourself, Jeremy. This is another thing. A lot of his opinions seem to be copy and pasted from his parents, but he admits that he is obsessive and he is compulsive. He says he likes routine, organisation, order, and he struggles with insomnia when he misses something off of his to-do list during the day. And he says that other staff members at ITV have noticed these tendencies and pointed them out to him. And again, I don't want to shame Jeremy for having OCD or OCD traits, because like, why would I do that? I hope it goes without saying that it's not the OCD that I have an issue with. It's the constant one rule for him and one rule for everyone else, and almost this need to be better than. In the book he says it annoys him when guests don't even try to get help prior to coming on the show, and it annoys him when some of them walk out of counselling sessions backstage. But has he ever tried to get help or had counselling? Counselling can be hard. I kind of get why some people might walk out of it. I don't know why Jeremy insists on judging these other people when he's just told us he has traits of OCD, he's had a problem with gambling and alcohol, which have impacted his home and family life, none of which he's had professional help for, or that, you know, he's disclosing. He finishes this section with, if my OCD gets worse, I'll call Graham Stanyet and do whatever he tells me to. It'll be my hard work and no one else's. Do you see what I mean about the minimising of the problems? But also like this air of superiority, like if I do get help, it'll be all of my hard work and no one else's. In another part of the book, he says it's only fair to talk about his failings considering what he does for a job, which I appreciate, and I think that that shows a level of self-awareness, but he says it with so much martyrdom. Like he says, I'm not someone who takes pleasure in talking about my failings, but I will for the sake of the book. Like, who takes pleasure in talking about their own failings? I don't get it. Within Jeremy's book, there's also an undercurrent of sexism. I'll just say it, okay? I'll just call it a spade, a bloody spade. I was gonna try and think of another way to say it, a more palatable way to say it, but no, it's almost like a boring realization, like, oh, it's sexism. There's nothing interesting happening here. But again, this sexist undercurrent, I think, just demonstrates how he doesn't seem to have much ability to interrogate his own thoughts, because if he did, I don't think he'd be saying sexist things. Pretty early on in the book, he's talking about how the UK had the highest rate of teenage pregnancy in Europe at the time, and about how young people are recklessly becoming pregnant after a night of binge drinking. Okay, Jez, you might actually have some points, but do you have to be such a judgy McJudgester about it? And then he smacks us with this absolute hot take. Even for 2009. He talks about meeting a 13-year-old girl, I assume on the show, who told him that she wanted to have a baby because she wanted someone to love her. Just take a moment to like think about how devastating that is. Jeremy then goes on to inform us that this 13-year-old girl lured 8 different men up to the age of 20 years old into having unprotected sex with her so that she could be pregnant. Well, Jeremy, in modern Britain that you seem to know so much about, that's what we call being nonced. I think that that is the worst thing I've ever heard Jeremy Kyle say, especially as he later describes Britain's tax resources as being gluttonously raped. 8 men having unprotected sex with a 13-year-old girl? Not rapists. People on benefits. Rapists. And as I've said, his thought patterns don't tie together, because in this book he bangs on about the importance of good parenting and how he blames the parents, but as we can see, he very much blames this 13-year-old girl. When he talks about the topics of sex and pregnancy in general, I think it's fair to say he places most of, if not all of the responsibility on the young women, saying things like young girls who get pregnant on a drunken night, because we all know they do that by themselves, and young girls with a few kids by different dads living in council houses, and young girls having group sex, and young girls should aim higher. And during a particularly fear-mongering section in his book about STIs, why is he talking about STIs? He describes the symptoms of chlamydia, but only on a female body. He goes on to talk about dysfunctional relationships because he's leaving no stone unturned, saying, and I quote, "If every girl who blindly dates and selfishly procreates with an abusive partner stepped back and said no, then maybe the depressing cycles perpetuating social injustice and social immobility in this country would be broken." Silly women, stop having sex with your abusive boyfriends. What are you like? You silly use. You see what I mean about calling a spade a spade? Like, I don't know what I'm meant to think about this other than it's just misogyny. There's not much more to say. And it's somewhat frustrating to me because I can see the points he's trying to get to about women having more self-worth and women standing up for themselves, but as this video's resident woman, I do think I'd feel a lot more insecure if someone was to call me selfish and I don't know, blame me for all of the social injustice in the country. I think this is a good example of how when Jeremy points out a perceived flaw in another person, his thought process usually ends there, rather than trying to work out why he believes that's a flaw. He could be asking himself, why do I think this is solely a woman's responsibility? In Jeremy's lovely little book, he also speaks about the lie detectors that they have on the Jeremy Kyle show. He says that never in a million years would he take a lie detector test, although he says that he personally does believe the accuracy and that the producers told him the accuracy was at 96%, which we know from earlier that that isn't an exact figure. The last thing I'll mention about Jeremy's book is the story he tells about a time that he went a little bit too far on stage with a guest. So this will be interesting, right? A time where Jeremy is admitting that he is at fault, he is in the wrong. Well, apparently in one episode he told an old lady that she was such a terrible mother she should have been sterilised at birth. He says that the producers were in his earpiece telling him to calm down, but the audience was clapping and cheering and he was just caught up in the moment. And at first I thought, okay, how he's talking about this kind of sounds like regret maybe, or maybe guilt. It sounds like Jeremy has checked in with himself and realised that he can sometimes say things that aren't in alignment with who he is, but then he very quickly justifies his actions because in his opinion the lady was evil and beyond help. For how much Jeremy Kyle talks about personal responsibility, he's really taking none here, which is really disappointing. And Jeremy finished the book by saying, "I am no great philanthropist with a plan to save the world. I'm just an average, ordinary man." And Jeremy, I'm glad we agree on something. Okay, the DNA test results are in. You, Jeremy Kyle, are 100% a Tory. I'll be like, look at her, look at her, look at her. Everybody wanna look at her, look at her. Everything in this video so far has been me trying to give you context and background so that we can discuss this next thing. In May 2019, a man named Steve Diamond took his own life after being on the Jeremy Kyle show and his lie detector results coming back as deceptive. The Jeremy Kyle show was immediately cancelled after this, so it was really sudden and unplanned, and ITV promptly made a statement about the situation. Steve Diamond ended up on the show because he wanted to prove to his partner Jane that he wasn't cheating on her, so he suggested doing a lie detector test on Jeremy Kyle. This was something that was obviously very common for the show, as lie detector tests cost hundreds of pounds, but on the show you can get one for free, which is very appealing if you're not very well off financially. People in Steve Diamond's life referred to him as a really nice guy, a big softie, but also a pathological liar. Apparently he was just one of those people that lied a lot. He had admitted to lying in the past, but he was adamant that he didn't cheat on his partner Jane. The episode that Steve Diamond was on has never been aired, but according to those who were there, Jeremy laid into him as he does with a lot of his other guests. Apparently, one of the producers of this episode said this was the best episode of the show that they'd ever made, but they did feel sorry for Steve. After the deceptive lie detector results, Steve did tell the producers that he wanted to kill himself, but during the Channel 4 documentary that comes out later, we find out that that wasn't uncommon for guests to tell producers that. Steve Diamond was a vulnerable person who was somehow allowed onto a national TV show whose presenter is known for berating guests and being hostile and confrontational. He wasn't offered a second lie detector test or offered any support after the show, even when he vocalised that he was feeling suicidal. And it doesn't matter if he actually was telling the truth or not. He clearly was not mentally stable enough to understand what the outcomes of being on the show could possibly be. And ITV's procedures were not robust enough to catch this before allowing him onto the show, or take his suicidal ideation seriously and provide support after the show whether he wanted it or not. Steve Diamond was let down at every stage in this process, and his partner Jane blames herself. She doesn't think it's fair for her to blame the Jeremy Kyle show due to her own guilt that she feels. The whistleblower producers feel sad for Jane and think that she is vulnerable as well, as she apparently considers the ITV employees as her friends, and even got a tattoo of Jeremy Kyle's signature After the death of Steve and the cancellation of the show, ex-producers believe that that's all down to the manipulation and cult-like tendencies of the show. Erika Paulson and Paul McCartney have both taken their own lives since being on the show, and it is possible that there's more, or at least more people that have attempted. Erika Paulson went on the show in 2005, the year that it started, with her partner, and they took Jeremy's advice to split up. After filming the episode, the couple decided to take a few days break from each other and speak at the end of the week, but by then Erika had killed herself. Her partner, much like Steve Diamond's partner, blames himself for Erika's death. Then there's Paul McCartney, who went on the show in 2014 and was offered a place at a rehab facility, which he accepted. He was later kicked out of the facility because he was allegedly being abusive to the staff members there, and 3 months later he ended his own life. Then there's Natasha Redican, but she wasn't a guest on the Jeremy Kyle show, she was a producer. After the show's abrupt cancellation, they had to let a lot of their employees go, obviously, because there just wasn't a job for them anymore. This included Natasha, who ITV actually promised to help find more work, but that promise was never really fulfilled and she was left unemployed for several months. Natasha was one of the producers who worked on Steve Diamond's episode, and people close to Natasha say that she was absolutely racked with guilt about his death. And 9 months after Steve's suicide, Natasha took her own life. All of this is just so tragic. ITV made a statement about the death of Steve Diamond, the gist of which is, yes, very sad, but not our fault. Whereas with the death of Natasha Redican or the other connected suicides, I don't believe that they ever made an official statement. Jeremy Kyle himself didn't personally talk about anything for a good while, basically until after he came out of like a hibernation period and got a new role as a broadcaster on Talk Radio TV.
Last 2.5 years, as I'm sure are all aware, and I knew you'd ask about that, the show finished. Yes. After 14 years, rather suddenly. And to supersede you, and I'm just being straight because, you know, I'm really excited about joining here. When I can talk about what needs to be addressed, I will do it.
People will argue that Steve Diamond, just like all the other guests, consented. They consented to being filmed. They watched the show before. They knew what Jeremy was like. They should have known what they were getting themselves into. But this is why I talked at length about informed consent, mental health issues, disabilities, class, vulnerable members of society, because it's all relevant when we're talking about who has the capacity to make the decision to be on a controversial, conflict-based national TV show. If the show itself attracts people with highly dysfunctional personal lives and you're not screening for mental illness or disabilities adequately with the guidance of professionals, you are going to end up with unstable people on TV. People who may be at higher risk for harming themselves. Why did ITV and Jeremy Kyle just not understand that? Or did they understand that but they just weren't that bothered because the ratings were good? People will argue that ITV and the Jeremy Kyle show couldn't prevent people from ending their own lives. If someone wanted to hurt themselves, they would, whether the show was involved or not. And I think that this is both true and not true. I don't think it's accurate to say something like Jeremy Kyle killed those people. I think that attributes too much responsibility to the show. We know that when people do end their lives, it's not usually because of one reason or one event. It's typically a multitude of things. But you could argue that the Jeremy Kyle show provided an opportunity for suicide to happen, an opportunity where a guest's behaviour might be accelerated. Everything from the chosen demographic to the lax onboarding process to Jeremy's confrontational approach might have created a hotbed for underlying suicidal urges. We know that Jeremy Kyle guests typically had dysfunctional lives, sometimes with histories of abuse and trauma. And of course, it's not the show's responsibility for what happened in the guest's past, but surely it is the show's responsibility to acknowledge just how vulnerable these people may be and take serious precautions. And if your argument is that the show's safeguarding process could not have been any better, then maybe the show was unmanageable. Maybe the show shouldn't have existed because the level of care needed was impossible to provide. I am worried about highlighting how there may have been other contributing factors in the decision for these people to end their lives because, and I've seen this happening. People can use that as a way to excuse the Jeremy Kyle show for their role in things. It's very easy to say, well, clearly this person was not of sound mind, nothing to do with us. Let's say that these guests were unwell long before they came onto the show, and let's say they didn't enjoy their experience on the show and decided to hurt themselves. The Jeremy Kyle show was the last straw for them. That's still not a good thing. Do you want to be the final distressing event in someone's life that tips them over the edge? I don't see how this argument is valid at all. At the very least, if they were unwell beforehand, the show should have noticed and not allowed them on. So either way, the show has a role here. And as for the show's young producer, Natasha Redican, I think it's a similar thing. I'm sure Natasha had other things going on for her, but her being made redundant is ITV's responsibility. I understand that if a show is suddenly cancelled, that means that there are suddenly no more jobs, but this keeps circling back to maybe the Jeremy Kyle show wasn't a very stable idea to begin with. Working with vulnerable guests in the high tension environment that they were surely makes the whole operation unpredictable. I don't think the suicides connected to the show were unprecedented. I think that they were tragedies waiting to happen from the very start. On top of that, we have heard that ITV promised to help Natasha find other work, but didn't fulfill that promise. I guess we can't exactly confirm whether that's true or not, but if it is true, it's pretty heartless. When tragic things happen, especially if they personally affect you, I think it's normal to want someone or something to blame, because I suppose blame is a way for us to make sense of things that are hard to make sense of. I think when talking about people who lost their lives to suicide, blame is a very heavy word. I don't particularly like Jeremy Kyle as an individual, but I do think to be blamed personally for multiple suicides would be a very heavy burden to bear, especially when it's not really accurate anyway. Like, Jeremy Kyle was part of a big team at ITV, it wasn't just him, as well as the guests' past experiences and possible trauma and so on. I do think it's fair and accurate to say that Jeremy had some responsibility in terms of how he talked to his guests, how he expressed himself, how he acted as if his opinion was superior, how he allowed himself to become a superior presence in the workplace. And I think responsibility is the appropriate word here because it's empowering. It implies that the person with responsibility is in charge of something and can change something. It's not a condemnation, it's saying you might have behaved badly, but you have the power to not let it happen again. I also think similarly for the show and ITV as a whole, I think they had responsibility in terms of protecting and safeguarding guests, not exploiting guests, preventing unhealthy cultures in the workplace. Sadly though, Jeremy, the show and ITV have never accepted a smidge of responsibility for the events that unfolded. I'm not a legal expert, but I think if a company claims responsibility, then they have to accept legal action taken against them or something like that. So I get that ITV is trying to save themselves, but I can imagine that there are probably individuals at ITV who do partially take responsibility and feel guilty about what happened. They're just not allowed to say that publicly. Regardless, ITV came out of the subsequent inquiry looking pretty lame. The government's Digital, Culture, Media and Sports Committee held an inquiry looking into the Jeremy Kyle show in 2019 after the suicide of Steve Diamond, which, interestingly enough, Jeremy Kyle refused to attend. The inquiry was basically a board of MPs sitting across from Tom McLennan, the show's executive producer, Graham Stanier, the show's therapist, and Julian Bellamy, ITV's managing director and most punchable man alive. The dynamic that emerged between the committee and the panel of three kind of mimicked the dynamic between Jeremy and his guests. It was very clear that the committee was holding the power in this situation. They were kind of going in on the panel, which I know a lot of people will say is well deserved. The panel were often left stumbling on their words, repeating themselves, not really having answers, so just fumbling through, and the committee didn't let up for 2 hours. Then there was a second panel with Dame Carolyn McCall, the chief executive of ITV, Sir Peter Bazalgette, the president of the Royal Television Society, and Chris Wyson, a TV legal consultant. The committee were a lot nicer to these people, maybe because they're higher up in the ranks than the panel before, maybe because they had less contact with what was actually happening on the Jeremy Kyle show. As I said before, ITV didn't really admit any fault. But what's shocking to me is how they somehow managed to go beyond that. In the inquiry, some people were saying that they were actually proud of the Jeremy Kyle show. Like, read the room. ITV did say that they won't be hosting another talk show like Jeremy Kyle again, but they will be working with Jeremy as an individual on different future projects. And I'm going to be honest, I don't really like that. I like that they're not going to produce another version of the show, but I am surprised that they're standing by Jeremy as a broadcaster, considering how hostile and confrontational he is and how his style has been a focus of major criticism within this whole controversy. And I am a little bit confused because I've been looking online for like a result or an outcome of the inquiry, and I can't really find anything apart from what I just mentioned. So I don't know if I'm looking in the wrong place, but I'm left a bit like, what was the point of this inquiry? Am I misunderstanding something? I thought there was going to be like an official conclusion of some sort, but I can't see one. Jeremy Kyle came back into the public eye a couple of years after the inquiry took place in 2021 with an interview on Talk Radio TV. I wanted to see how he was going to approach things coming back, and I just don't feel like this interview was a good look for our Jez, like, at all. At the point of this interview, he said that he wasn't able to talk about the things that happened. I'm assuming for legal reasons, which obviously is fair enough, but I thought he would at least hint at it, or hint at how he felt sad about it. But him and the interviewer just launch straight into talking about how bad things were for him.
I think I suffered from real shock. Yeah. The whole life for 14, 15 years was to the day, to the time, and suddenly that's all gone. Suddenly you're in this place where you think, God, I was just doing my job, I was working hard, I did what everybody said, and OK, the world finishes, 15 years is a good run. I think it was the suddenness of it, but that...
And listen, this is the thing, right? I don't actually doubt that. I don't doubt that it would be very emotionally taxing to be the face of a TV show that was cancelled because a guest killed themselves. I'm sure that that was hard. But Jeremy, my dude, it comes across as tone deaf. It's giving self-absorbed. It's giving woe is me. It's also interesting when we think about how much the show and ITV banged on about the guests giving informed consent. Couldn't that same logic be applied to Jeremy? Did he not give his informed consent to be the face of a controversial TV show? Shouldn't he have known that if the show was praised in the media, it would be his name and face plastered everywhere? But that also applies if there was a scandal or a controversy. Wasn't he smart enough to understand everything the job encompassed? Following Jeremy's comeback, Channel 4 brought out a two-part documentary at the start of 2022 called Jeremy Kyle, Death on Daytime. I highly recommend watching it if you haven't seen it, because it includes a lot of unbroadcast behind-the-scenes footage, which honestly blew my mind. The way that Jeremy would speak to not only the guests but the crew members and the audience. It's hard not to believe that this man had a god complex after watching that. The documentary touches on how the show exploited people from lower classes, using them for entertainment and allowing them to be mocked by the public. It also platforms the opinions of anonymous ex-employees who refer to Jeremy as a cult leader and verbally abusive, and refer to the show as causing psychological carnage. It also went into the conditions that the producers had to work under and the culture in the workplace. The producers claimed that they would work 14 to 15-hour days. Sometimes they weren't allowed to eat dinner until they booked a guest onto the show, and producers would sometimes get fired if they weren't managing to book guests. The producers also mentioned how, as a team, they kind of became desensitized to the dysfunction that they were dealing with. Day in and day out, they were exposed to what they call high-level traumas through interacting with the guests. And remember, they are not trained mental health professionals. All of this was normalized within the workplace, and I think that this is a really important piece to acknowledge when talking about how the Jeremy Kyle show unraveled. I'm glad that the Jeremy Kyle show is over. I think it should have ended a long time ago. I actually think it should have never existed in the first place. But I can see how it developed through Britain's demonisation and stereotyping of the lower classes, the influence of American talk shows. I think that it definitely exploited vulnerable people. And as much as I don't want to patronise guests or take away their autonomy, I believe it's reasonable to say that there are a lot of guests who should not have been allowed on. I think the Jeremy Kyle Show and ITV did not have enough understanding of the mission they were taking on with this show, or maybe they just didn't have enough compassion to care. Honestly, at this point I'm kind of thinking it's the second one. Okay, well, this has been exhausting. Let me know your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. Subscribe to my channel and leave a like. It would mean a lot because I've worked really hard on this video, so I would appreciate it. Take care and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Jeremy, Kyle, can you help me out with the paternity of my firstborn child?
Like, wow, sit your martyr, Jeremy, our short king, you filthy Tory.